So this is a review of the Apocalypse Now final cut, which I want to talk about and sort of do a compare and contrast a little bit between the preceding two cuts. So the editors here are very important, of course. Editors in the original 1979 film, theatrical release, being Richard Marks and Walter Murch. These were experienced editors, sound and video, who had worked with Francis Ford Coppola for quite a while on The Godfather and other projects. And I thought the 1979 cut kind of stood on its own. It was, it's a brilliant cut, of course. And when I heard about the 2001 complete Dossier release, I was very excited about that because I had always felt, when I was watching the traditional cut, theatrical cut, that there were some scenes missing. In particular, the famous French Plantation sequence, which I'd heard about and read about. And when I was watching the theatrical cut, I always thought there was a tonal shift between the death of Clean, Mr. Clean, played by Lawrence Fishburne, that didn't quite fit up with the rest of the film, in the sense that they skip over Clean's death. They just kind of, he's killed. I mean, he had just, famously, he's in the sampan. He's just machine gunned a bunch of Vietnamese sailors, fishermen, in the sampan sequence, and is then kind of just quickly dispatched in a sort of a tragic scene, because we know he's listening to a tape recording that his mother has sent him, telling him, can't wait for you to come home safe, and so on. So it's sort of tragic, but nothing. He just vanishes from the film after dying or being killed. So the plantation sequence now was supposed to fit in right after Clean's death and provide, kind of slow things down a little bit after the intensity of that sequence. So what it had occurred to me was that I could definitely do with seeing, or the movie could certainly do with, a longer cut, an extended cut. So when the complete Dossier came out, the 2001 release, I was about 16 years old, and I was very excited to see this because I was such a fan of the film, and I felt like this was going to be a real, it would be really exciting to see all this additional footage. Now, unfortunately, sort of like the disappointment surrounding the release of the Star Wars prequel, notably The Phantom Menace in 1999, my hopes in this regard were foolishly optimistic, and ultimately I was destined to be disappointed. And the reason for that was because the complete Dossier cut, although it is complete in this sense, is a dog's breakfast. The original edit by Marks and Murch was so good, especially the sound cutting on it, that there were the complete Dossier just felt flabby, as in the things that had been cut, possibly with the exception of the French Plantation sequence, deserved to be cut. So, and in some cases, the rearranging of the sound, I thought, had worsened the film. So I was rewatching it, the complete Dossier, just recently, and one of the things I noticed that was most worrying was the scene where Willard, played by Martin Sheen, first opens the Dossier, and he's looking through that. And the sound, music there, which is done by Carmen Coppola, is perfect in that it sort of entices you into it, and then you have this really interesting military political narration as Sheen is reading through the Dossier. And for whatever reason, in the complete Dossier, they have changed the timing of that reading of the Dossier, and so it doesn't have the same kind of like esoteric sense of secret knowledge, that goes along with the reading of this secret, classified report, which is a feeling, I might add, that's perfectly fitting with the Vietnam War itself. Classified war really plays out, as we know, for the Pentagon Papers released, the leaks by Daniel Ellsberg. It plays out in the congressional testimony chambers, the secret closed-door testimony, just as much as it does on the battlefield. And so, they say that in the narration, of course, when Willard says that Kurtz, played by Marlon Brando, has written a report that's been restricted. Even Lyndon Johnson, he says, wasn't able to see this report. So you see, there's this, there's a secret, there's these secrets going on in the movie, and that's played out brilliantly in the scene where Willard meets with the CIA official and the general and Harrison Ford, and he is compelled to deny the assassination missions that this Willard has carried out in the past. So we know right away there that there's multiple levels to the story taking place. The kind of official narrative, which we know turns out to be a lie, in the really adaptive nature of the story, being as it is a adaptation of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness about British colonialism in the Congo, and how in that story, of course, the original story, which, as I mentioned, Apocalypse Now is an adaptation, as the British are going up the river, the supposed veneer, I mean, really this is the veneer of civilization is peeling away from these steamboat traders, and of course they end up confronting Kurtz, who is gone native, crazy, but is in a way more connected with the reality of life in the jungle of the Congo than the perspective from the boardrooms back in the city of London. So Conrad's novel is about exactly that. It's about this fantasy that civilization, the Kipling kind of white man's burden, that the fantasy that they sell to the colonializers, who then have to go out and confront the reality and see that in fact this civilization is really just certainly the imperial civilization is not a very nice thing in its actual day-to-day functioning on the river, as it were. And this is what makes ultimately Apocalypse Now such a brilliant movie, is being able to adapt Conrad to the context of the Vietnam War. You can read all about the political decision-making that sort of led to the catastrophes in the Vietnam War in Robert McNamara's In Retrospect here, which is a quite an interesting book where he describes McNamara, of course, sort of flipped on the war. Initially, he, as part of the Kennedy and Johnson administration as the Secretary of Defense, had been for the war in the sense that he believed it could be managed and utilizing the talents of the best and brightest, as the #1 Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times best-selling book by David Halberstam describes in great detail. McGeorge Bundy, Dean Rusk, McNamara himself, Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy before his assassination. They all believe that they can use their rationalism to sort of manage the war, to do targeted bombing. It's going to, like we see in Afghanistan today, right? Like, it's going to degrade the enemy and eventually defeat them. And McNamara, of course, for example, had worked on the strategic bombing survey under Curtis LeMay, as he describes in his Errol Morris interview, Thought of War, released in 2003, around the time of the Iraq War. Another tragic mistake in American foreign policy. But anyway, McNamara, of course, being this strategic bombing kind of guy, believes that they can, again, utilize targeted bombing to win the war, and that they can do it with a light footprint. They might not need to put so many troops in. They can kind of manage this rationally and so on. And what happens during the Lyndon Johnson years, in particular, is Johnson tries to win the war militarily with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and General William Westmoreland, as is described in H.R. McMaster's book, Dereliction of Duty. H.R. McMaster, of course, recently, he was involved famously in the Battle of 73 Easting as the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. Was a company commander, Captain H.R. McMaster, but then was recently in the Trump administration, hence the hat, the National Security Advisor with Jim Mattis and a few other ex-Marines and soldiers. So all of this political military background and the sort of official story is very important to the context of the novel. I say novel, I mean Joseph Conrad here, but really I mean the adaptation of the novel Apocalypse Now. And that's why the different cuts are so interesting to see, because they bring they change what the viewer takes away from the film experience. So the initial theatrical cut, as I say, is a very coruscating kind of psychedelic cut, but it's maybe not perfect. There are minor areas where it could be improved. Now the complete Dossier goes too far in that it just throws everything in, and it's a bit of a mishmash. The Playboy Bunny scene after Susie Q, Creedence Clearwater, when they go to Lance, this is how Lance gets his camouflage, right? It's the makeup that the Playboy Bunnies give him. They go to meet the Playboy Bunnies, and here we see again this contrast where they have just come in, you know, like these angels, like the Valkyries, right, out of heaven, in the, you know, Nibelungen sense and the Wagnerian sense, and they are entertaining the GIs, you know, this kind of erotic display, which the locals don't understand at all, but is very American, right? But then in the next sequence, which is included in the complete Dossier, we see them meeting with the boat crew, and they're living, the bunnies this is, are living in kind of a shabby tent village, and it's raining out, and there's mud everywhere, like bodies kind of strewn around, and they can barely get enough diesel fuel, and all this. And so there's this, again, contrast between the, right, like, celebrity portrayal and the political dynamic, which is a fantasy, and then the very barbaric, you know, reality, kind of cyberpunk themes that I actually think about this. But we see that very clearly in the complete Dossier in some of these scenes. And like I say, that's an interesting scene, that Playboy Bunny scene, but it's maybe unnecessary because in the original cut, the very next scene, of course, is them continuing up the river, and so we sort of we don't necessarily, I mean, that voyage up the river comes to dominate the whole story, so maybe it's not necessary to spell out every individual area, you know, like who really cares how Lance gets his makeup set. Anyway, the final cut, I thought, did a very good job. It managed to kind of balance, it is the right middle ground. It balances between the two cuts. So it does a couple of things specifically that are very smart. So one thing it does, I mean, firstly, it restores the quality of the film. So it's a very high quality cut, beautiful cut, and I would recommend it just for the restoration. You know, everything else notwithstanding, and it sounds great, you know, etc. So brilliant cut, restoration in that regard, aesthetically. Now, some of the things it does in terms of the restructuring of the film are some are quite nuanced and some are very significant. So one of the more nuanced things it does, I'll give you an example, is it removes the Rolling Stones sequence, which is when Lance is water skiing. And this is just when Willard has first been introduced to the boat crew in the original cut. And it sort of makes sense for it to be there because it's showing, you know, they're kind of naive and they're just like partying or whatever. And it moves that scene to where it actually clearly was in the original cut, which is in this movie sequence, which is very closer to the end, actually before the sampan sequence. And I thought that was, at first I was kind of like, oh, why did they cut the Rolling Stones bit? But then it made sense. It actually fits better in its proper place once you've kind of gotten to know the characters a little bit. So you can sense that they haven't really learned very much maybe from this experience, which is true actually as you go, you know, right through the whole movie. The Americans they're not really learning anything. This is repeated in the French Plantation sequence, which is a very important scene actually. Again, Ford Coppola on his best Godfather filmmaking. So like if you watch Hearts of Darkness, the documentary made by Coppola and his wife about making Apocalypse Now, you'll see that behind the scenes when they were filming the Plantation sequence, you know, they wanted the wine to be at exactly the right temperature and the accents to be just right. So it's a beautifully filmed scene. And one of the things that happens in that sequence is, well, the French patriarch of the plantation is kind of, you know, dying, and he's an old man, and he's, you know, he refuses to give up to the Vietnamese. The younger patriarch is, well, Willard asks him, you know, how can you people live here? Don't you know you're going to be wiped? You know, the North Koreans are going to get rid of you, and excuse me, the North Vietnamese, and this French paratrooper has to tell him, you know, no, after Dien Bien Phu, we will never give up, and this is our land, and you know, so on. And you Americans don't understand this. One of the other Frenchmen tells Willard how, you know, you Americans are making the same mistakes that we did. How could you be so stupid, right, to get involved in this, make mistakes? But we know from the Neil Sheehan from the Pentagon Papers. If you watch the movie The Post, starring Meryl Streep and Tom Hanks, the Spielberg movie that came out recently, you'll see very clearly how the politicians and the military personnel knew about all of this going back to the Truman administration, and that the war was probably unwinnable, and that they got suckered into it anyway, and Eisenhower made it worse, and John F. Kennedy, of course, who created the Green Berets, you may or may not know, which is what Kurtz is. Colonel Kurtz is, of course, a soldier who comes back to the States, trains up, enters the Green Berets as a counterinsurgency specialist, and then goes back to Vietnam, where he then starts running the war on his own terms, which the military doesn't like, of course, and Kurtz's terms are, as we see later in the film when Dennis Hopper is introduced, playing the Russian the Russian jester in Conrad. Anyway, Kurtz is Brando, that has lost it, right? He's gone native, and his methods are unsound, as they say, or as Willard says, I don't see any method at all here. It's just heads lying everywhere and so on. And that's one of the areas where, again, the right decision was made in the cut. So so there's also some interesting changes to the Robert Duvall sequences, the Kilgore attack sequences as well. I'll just mention that briefly. There's an introduction to Kilgore where he lands in his Huey, which is not in the original cut, and I don't think it's in the complete dossier either. And it's just a very short sequence, but it's very well timed, because a lot of people, having watched Apocalypse Now, of course, know that the forthcoming Kilgore scene, the Ride of the Valkyries, smell of napalm in the morning, these are big, notable scenes. And having Duvall descend from the heavens, again, like the Valkyries, in his helicopter, and he's got his cavalry hat on, that is all very fitting for setting up his character. It's a very short little change, but it's noticeable, and again, it's the right decision there. Builds up the suspense even more. But again, going back to the Kurtz sequences, so one of the things that happens there is that in the complete dossier, there's a scene where we see Kurtz with Willard, and he's reading the newspaper articles, sort of again a reference to the Pentagon Papers. And he's filmed in complete light, so you see him in the light. And I thought that was a big mistake to include that in the complete dossier. I mean, maybe not in the complete dossier, if Coppola was preparing to make these cuts all along, these three various cuts. But it was better to have cut it in the original film, because of course the Brando performance is much more spectacular when he's filmed entirely in darkness, and you only see him, wearing camouflage in the rain. You never really completely see him. He's always silhouetted and so on. It makes him more mysterious, which is the right decision. So to see him in full light, even if the scene is kind of interesting and important, it doesn't fit with the tone at that time. And so I thought, again, that's the kind of thing that is cut from the final cut, and I think correctly so. Again, hitting just that right line between the things you want included, like the French Plantation sequence and like these, the psychedelic restoration. It was the cut that, and I said to a friend of mine, it was the cut that sort of I wanted to see when I was a bit younger. It's a little bit longer, gives you a little more movie, and includes enough interesting stuff that's not in the original that's worth preserving, but retains the vitality and the intensity and the emotion that is correctly established in the original cut through a very judicious, use of editing, of which, now I can give you another example. I'll give many examples of this, but another one is, for example, the editors were saying, I read an article about this from when Jarhead was released, a couple years ago, a decade ago now, I think. Of course, the Marines in that movie watch a version of Apocalypse Now, and the cut in that scene in Jarhead is done by the same editor, I believe. So he says how one of the things he wanted to do in the original cut was switch from the approaching Huey helicopters when they turn on Wagner to the village, Charlie's Point, right, where you can see them, the school children running around, and they're prepared. The Viet Cong are coming out and they're preparing to militarize to defend the village. And in the original sequence, apparently Ford Coppola just had that being one long take without that cut to show you the dissonance between the approaching Americans and the defending Vietnamese. And the editor, again, was absolutely right to make that decision to switch the angle there so that you can see the dissonance between the two forces, the enemy, really the two enemies, the two antagonists. And so, again, that is something that shows you like that the original cut was quite masterful. So the original cut is fantastic. I would recommend that. I wouldn't necessarily recommend seeing the complete dossier unless you're just curious to see sort of all of the footage, you know, as much of the footage as you possibly can. It might be worth a watch in that regard. But I feel that most people will be disappointed with it, the complete dossier that is, and I would recommend instead that they watch the final cut as a nice middle ground, balanced cut between the two.